Hello, everybody. What an introduction. It's nice to be here. It's good to be with you in Leeds. I also see that there are some Manchester people with us, so that's good to see you too. I'm just going to try and see if I can get this to actually share properly. There we go. There we go. So yes, as Jemima said, I am in Manchester, Director Environment Officer, and also a curate in a very urban parish. And I'm going to, I do a lot of teaching already on pastoral care, and we'll be doing a deprof in pastoral care in the issues of creation breakdown. So what I'm going to do first is talk about eco-anxiety, what that is, just give some background to it, and then hand over to Hannah, who will talk about climate grief as well. So let's begin. So what is eco-anxiety? Well, the first thing to sort of recognise is that anxiety is a normal emotion that we all experience. And it's a feeling of worry, nervousness or unease about something that has an uncertain outcome. And anxiety can be a helpful emotion because it heightens our awareness to situations that need attention. It's part of our response to the things that are going on around us. But like with any emotional response, if it starts to overwhelm us or preoccupy us to the point where we're struggling to maintain those ideas of a healthy life and healthy relationships, then it can become an issue. And I need to point out that our measures of what a healthy life will look like differs from person to person as well. So there are different understandings of this for different people. Paul Tillich, whom I'll talk a bit about again later, he made a distinction between fear and anxiety. Fear being something that has a definite object, so it's quite concrete in what we're fearful of, and anxiety being a more abstract. But as Tillich says, whilst there's slightly different conceptual ideas, they're actually inseparable. The sting of fear is anxiety, and anxiety strives towards fear. So discussions around anxiety are also always linked with the emotions of fear. The definitions for eco-anxiety, we have two there, a chronic fear of environmental doom, and Glenn Albrecht calls it this generalised sense that the ecological foundations of existence are in the process of collapse. And that's from Glenn Albrecht's book from 2012 called Earth. Oh, no, that's not from Earth Emotions, but I'll quote from Earth Emotions later, which is a good book that I would recommend to you. But the eco-anxiety is basically a fear that's rooted in the sense of the ecological aspects of our world are changing, and there's a fear about an anxiety about what that might mean. So how is it being manifested? Well, Caroline Hickman from Bath University has done quite a lot of research on this, particularly around young people, because there is a recognition that it's eco-anxiety is increasing amongst young people. And she's interviewed children in the UK and in the Maldives, and she cites previous studies that have found that 45% of children suffer lasting depression after extreme weather and natural disasters. And this is obviously something that we are going to encounter more and more. The cognitive dissonance between what is said and what is done is especially impactful upon eco-anxiety amongst young people. So there's this thing about, well, on the one hand, the UK declares a climate emergency, but on the other hand, approves expansion of an airport. And these dissonances between what is being said and what is being done create this level of eco-anxiety, particularly amongst young people, because there's a sense of a lack of integrity and hypocrisy and no sense of and a loss of trust, therefore, about what is being said. So broken promises, inaction, coupled with the enormity of the climate crisis, Caroline Hickman says these are the things that are really impacting on the eco-anxiety levels of young people. And symptoms of this include despair, restlessness, depression, and what is termed as eco-paralysis, which is basically you get so overwhelmed by the anxiety that even though you're really passionate about eco-action and making a change, the anxiety kind of overwhelms you and stops you being able to do it. There are some maladaptive coping mechanisms which people sometimes adopt, which aren't helpful because they don't actually address the underlying anxiety. But the things like distancing and denial from the issues are often things that we might adapt to try and protect ourselves from the anxiety. A lot of the work that I'm using today is from somebody called Panu Pikala, who is a priest in Finland, and the reference for his book is there, but I'll also send it to Jemima afterwards, for his chapter in the book is there. He's written a lot of stuff about eco-anxiety, and he mentions very clearly that obviously the severity and the manifestation varies worldwide, and we need to be aware of that. What we're experiencing here is very different to what people are experiencing who are experiencing the first-hand effects of the climate emergency, those with the least resources and those who are the most vulnerable. And Panu talks a lot about, he obviously locates his talk and his thinking about eco-anxiety in his context, which is what I will do. I will locate it in our context, in my context here in Manchester and in the West, but recognising that this is not, this is more than just something that happens with us, and recognising that what we're experiencing is different from what people in the global south and across the world are experiencing because of their first-hand effects of the climate emergency and how that's affecting their lives directly. Eco-anxiety is related to existential anxiety. So it's connected to deep spiritual and theological questions about what the meaning of life is, and is there anything more than this, and those kind of things. So you can see how eco-anxiety and faith really interlink here. Tillich had a model of existential anxiety. He highlighted three domains of apprehension, he calls them: anxiety about faith and death, anxiety about emptiness and meaningfulness, and anxiety about guilt and condemnation. And all of these can be applied to eco-anxiety, this anxiety about is there more to life than this? The death of things that we might, hold dear, the death of people, the death of species, and also the anxiety about guilt, the guilt that we hold because of our contributions maybe to the current situation, and how that might perpetuate the anxiety that we have. As I've already said, anxiety can be a helpful emotion, and it heightens our awareness to situations that need attention. So it's something to be aware of. If we're feeling anxious about something, it's because something needs our attention. Anxiety, therefore, increases in people who feel that they are lone voices. Because if you feel anxiety in a place that nobody else appears to be in, it can generate these questions of, am I being dramatic? Does no one else care? And this further fuels the anxiety that one might feel themselves. So one of the things we need to do, and Panu talks about this in his chapter, is we need to practice manageable ways of living with anxiety. It's important to recognise that eco-anxiety isn't something that we are going to be able to necessarily get rid of. We need to work out how to manage how we live with it, so that hope and resilience can be strengthened. And liberating people from the consuming grip of eco-anxiety increases well-being, resilience, and can empower people into social action. If we find ways to manage anxiety and approach the anxiety that we have in constructive ways, it can actually help to empower us and helps us find ways of meaning that can sort of help us deal with the situation that we're all facing. I'm going to talk more in the second half about how we can respond. So I'm going to give you some practical examples of what we have done in our context in terms of responding to issues of worrying and eco-anxiety. But as Panu mentions in his chapter, it's really important to not only just to engage with the positivity, so engage with hopeful, meaningful action, good things, but also it's equally important to acknowledge that these dark emotions exist, as Panu calls them, to acknowledge that they're here, and acknowledge that this is part of our human condition, really, and part of our human experience, that we do have these dark emotions. Meaning making in a response to eco-anxiety is really important. Finding meaning in our context and in the wider world helps us to deal with the eco-anxiety and manage it in a way that builds resilience and gives us a sense of purpose. So what's really important here is that the hope that we talk about and that we give is related to meaningfulness rather than false optimism. We can't dismiss our feelings of eco-anxiety by saying, well, it's going to be okay, everything's going to be fine, because the reality is that this is not the reality that we're living with or that we see. And as we heard earlier on from the research with young people, when we start sort of saying things that clearly aren't borne out in reality, that actually increases people's anxiety. So what we need to do with our is find hope in meaningful ways. Hope that gives us meaning and is something that is not necessarily saying that everything's going to be okay, because that, as I've said, is actually that's not helpful, but that we can still find hope in the place that we're in now. Now, I've rushed through a lot of concepts there about eco-anxiety and a lot of understandings, and we can unpack some of that later on. There'll be breakouts where we can talk about some of that. But what I'm going to do now is hand over to Hannah, who will then talk more about climate grief.
Thank you, Grace. It's wonderful to hear from you and to set that stage for some of what we're living with and what we're navigating. I'm going to just also attempt to share my screen, and hopefully you should all be able to see that now. So what I want to do is build on some of the themes that Grace has introduced in her sort of exploration of the ways that eco-anxiety manifests and how we can understand it psychologically and what it might mean for the decisions we make in pastoral care. I'm going to focus more on grief experiences, so they're closely related to feelings of anxiety. And I want to introduce, I guess, a theological frame for interpreting these grief experiences and how we might also think about eco-anxiety theologically now that we understand it better. But before we go into some of those dynamics and possibilities of lament for our church communities, I just want to tell you a little bit about me and perhaps some of the wider background to why I became so interested in this particular way of thinking about climate and ecological breakdown. So I grew up in a Christian family where climate justice and faith were never really seen as antithetical. My granddad was a climate scientist and an evangelical Christian. So for me, seeing the place of climate science in Christian engagement with the world was never really an issue. But I think one of the odd consequences of that influence when I was younger is that while I knew that climate breakdown was a very serious problem from quite a young age, I recall him warning me as a child that if governments didn't take action soon, that there would be whole countries underwater. He would speak very passionately about, for example, Bangladesh, and ask, where will they go? What do you think they're going to do? So I was aware of that dynamic from a young age, but also, I guess, slightly ironically, because people who I knew and trusted were working very hard to push governments and corporations in the right direction, that led to a kind of subconscious acceptance that by the time I was an adult, climate change would be under control. Now, I don't think that I'm 29, so I don't think that kind of assumption is uncommon in people who are now my age or slightly younger, but grew up with this, I guess, this model or this rhetoric in their education of the myth of progress. That, we're only moving in the direction of greater peace and happiness and comfort worldwide, that we've solved the major problems, and that climate change is another one that, with the right ingenuity and the right set of people in power, we can solve this problem too. And very much that was the assumption that was baked into the education that I received. When I was about 16, my parents became guardians for 3 teenagers and a baby who arrived in the UK as refugees from the Democratic Republic of Congo. And through our relationship, I became conscious of the ways that human suffering was not only tied to the kind of big picture effects of a changing climate, but also to extraction from the land and the ecological destruction that we've participated in. And around that time, a number of my close family members were experiencing serious illness. And I was also diagnosed with quite severe depression following a series of traumatic events. And as a result of these different experiences, I began to explore what faith means in the bleak places where there isn't a quick fix or a simple answer. At university, I became an earnest activism person. I had a strong belief in the idea that writing letters and signing petitions and raising money could solve a lot of problems. And it was only in going through considerable failure in that area that I began to accept that perhaps that wasn't true. It was failure both in seeing campaigns that I had organized fail, but also in discovering that my attempts to disentangle myself from unjust systems was like endlessly peeling back layers of an onion, that I couldn't achieve innocence. And I'm sure that some of you here who have been involved in environmental activism for a long time might recognize some of those dynamics too. That sense of frustration over huge amounts of energy poured into campaigns that don't seem to go anywhere, and also this sense of your own personal kind of conviction and sitting with that. And I think it was at that point that I entered a kind of quiet grief state in the background of the rest of my life, which, was very privileged and very happy in many ways. But I only really named that experience as climate grief a few years later when the 2018 IPCC report came out. And I realized that so much of my own response and the church's response to major climate and ecological threats was just to make longer and longer lists of things to do different or better. Or there was a lot of mining the Christian tradition to find bits that seemed to fit. So, a bit of St. Francis here and a bit of the Celtic tradition there, without much willingness to take seriously the spiritual significance of living in a time of profound loss. And it turns out that I'm not alone in feeling this way. In the wider context of what Grace introduced us to earlier, the last decade has seen rapidly growing reports of grief, anxiety, and traumatic stress as a result of increasingly extreme weather events, the loss of flora and fauna, or awareness of the existential threat posed by climate breakdown. So here are just some of the headlines from the last couple of years. Climate despair is making people give up on life. I have felt hopelessness over climate change. Here is how we move past the immense grief. Iceland holds funeral for first glacier lost to climate change. The search for environmental hope. Climate news is relentlessly, objectively grim. Should we ever allow ourselves to feel optimism? In India, children grapple with the aftermath of farmer suicides. Nearly 60,000 farmer suicides have been linked to climate change. How scientists are coping with ecological grief. Climate grief expected to be widespread soon, but it's still not openly acknowledged. Derby staff and students given climate change anxiety therapy. Grief, frustration, guilt. The bushfires show the far-reaching mental health impacts of climate change. Or my personal favorite, apocalypse got you down, maybe this will help. Searching for a cure for my climate crisis grief. So how do we respond? Well, our churches are becoming better at proposing good things Christians should do in response to these crises. Maybe that's changes to energy use or signing petitions or nature spirituality and so on. And I'm not saying that these things aren't good things. They are worthy things. They're all worthy of our time and attention. But basically, Christian engagement with environmental questions has been reduced to what we call ethics. We ask which resources or tools can be drawn from a spiritual tradition in order to persuade people to behave in more ethical ways. And I don't believe that just giving people rules to follow is sufficient for imagining what our faith means in light of the scale of this crisis and the trauma experienced. What, for example, is the role of our church communities in responding to the experiences of first and second generation migrants or refugees, either fleeing the impact of climate breakdown or watching from a distance as their overseas community is devastated? What is a Christian response to communities in this country devastated by flooding, farmers struggling against increasingly unpredictable weather, the anxiety and stress triggered in inner cities by hot summers with air pollution, no aircon, and no green spaces which offer relief? What do we have to say to young people who have given up on the idea of a stable future, parents who are frightened for their children? We remain ill-equipped for the pastoral implications of the world that we are entering. Now, one thing I am certain our response will require is lament. Pastoral care cannot be offered without collective acknowledgement of this grief. So I want to explore lament as a pastoral response now, both in our worship together and in what lament might bring about as a call to action. Well, what is lament? And it's worth beginning by noting that the discipline of lament is not, I'm saying, a replacement for other kinds of pastoral care, but it is, I believe, a central part of it. Most of us are likely already aware that in a more general sense, expressions of grief in community are a vital part of coping well with loss, trauma, and injustice. But what exactly do we mean by lament, and how can we do it well? Well, the idea of lament in response to the suffering of the world is, I think, becoming increasingly popular. I certainly see it used a lot more now in church spaces than I did 5 years ago. People will talk about needing to lament more often, I think. But lament is different from our individual feelings of grief. Our individual grief is important, but it's not enough on its own to be what we mean by lamentation. This is because lament is a form of prayer. When we cry out to God, we do not do so alone. We are part of the community of those who also cry out to God, whether visible or invisible, and that extends to the whole of creation. This means that for true lament, we need to attend to the laments of others, not just our own. And in attending to the laments of others, we also prevent lament from just being for those who feel sad. Lamentation is not just for the times we want to mourn, but it's a position we can take towards the world and a discipline for the church which goes beyond our personal experience, in the same way that praising God is a discipline for the church, no matter what we're currently going through. So lament is prayer, expressing our sorrow, our anger, and our desire for justice to God. It is woven into the life of the community. It is a stance towards the world that we can take, acknowledging that it is the fitting response to the death which sin brings about. It is not limited by our personal feelings or experiences, though these can certainly provoke and influence lamenting together. So here's a reflection on lament as community activity from Maria Andrade. Oh, I'm going to share this first and then go back. Sorry, they're slightly out of order slides. Here's a reflection on lament as community activity from Maria Andrade, an Ecuadorian theologian.
My name is Maria Andrade and I come from Ecuador. Lament is not a popular practice within many modern and postmodern societies. Often, it is quite the opposite, as sentiments of hope and victory make people feel much better and in much easier ways. A dominant capitalist culture does not help either, because grief competes with empty narratives of, sometimes fake, success. This is not the case in many indigenous traditions in Latin America, also known as Abya Yala, who conceive and embrace grief as an integral part of life. Lament allows them to keep on track and find the way when it is lost. In similar ways, some Christian traditions have embraced grief and death as unavoidable aspects of Christian life. Death is a theological concept and is expressed in images like dying to the old self, or images as the wheat seed that needs to die in order to come to life and bring fruit. These theological concepts around death help us to avoid the temptation of running away from grief and instead giving it enough space to restore and give life. A spirit of lament is then where we must begin if we are to step towards healing.
I also want to emphasize, as Maria says, that lament is a step towards healing. It cannot then be the same as despair, and it should not leave us in despair. Now, here I'm referring to despair as a kind of sin rather than a temporary emotional state, which all of us experience at some time or another, including the psalmist. And one way I think we can tell whether our despair is sinful is if we are behaving in ways which create despair in others. Well, how is lament distinct to this? It's distinct because lament is directed to God, and so it acknowledges the openness of the future. This is not to say that God doesn't know the future, but it is to say that we don't know the future, and claiming we do is arrogance. In despair, we assume that we know what will happen and there is nothing to be done. We begin to fear the powers of this world more than we fear God. And if the beginning of wisdom is the fear, that is the awe, the worship of the Lord, we cannot be both wise and despairing. Our lament needs to clearly differentiate ourselves from despairing narratives. So long as we do not enter a state of despair, we will always have more moments to act humbly and generously. And if we take this approach to lament, by seeing it as a discipline of prayer for the whole community, this will also shape how we go about it. It will become part of the heartbeat of the community, conducted in the context of the conviction that God always hears us, and in preparation for penitent action. It will become a rhythm for us, shaped both by our experiences in our community and the suffering of others. And it will invite us to works of healing in the face of brokenness, works of life in the face of death. So what does lament commit us to? Or to put it another way, what works of healing and life should it bring about in us? Well, one of the most consistent themes I've found in expressions of climate and ecological grief is the sense of a loss of control. Feelings of powerlessness, being overwhelmed, fighting against a tide. And this can be reinforced by our focus on personal negative actions like reducing plastic waste, rather than balancing those things, which are very important, with collective positive actions, where we make something new together. That is, we participate in healing action. And if climate and ecological grief can be triggered by this loss of control, one of the pastoral care responses which makes most sense of our lament is to provide outlets which can bring about healing for the earth. In particular, local wildlife, biodiversity, and allotment projects are an excellent opportunity for churches, since many of them either have their own green space or are well placed to collaborate with local organisations in supporting a community project. Time in green space is well documented as something which eases anxiety and stress for people. And if we connect that with experiences of ecological grief and anxiety, which can be soothed by being able to see the possibility of healing in the world, then participating in projects which enable us to create spaces of healing in nature around us are one of the really powerful tools we have for approaching climate grief. Action, and particularly collective action, is a vital part of pastoral response. But note the order here: we lament and then we act. Action is the second step and not the first. Not only because it fulfills true lament, which believes that God hears our pain, invites us to repentance, and will renew the earth, but it's also central to practicing hope. For the purposes of pastoral care in the light of climate breakdown, I believe hope is best understood not as an emotion, but as a virtue, like love. It is expressed in action and not wishful thinking. It is very difficult to avoid despair if we cannot see the possibility of change in our own community, that is, if we cannot practice hope. Or to put it another way, if we cease to believe that we can pursue holiness. And this pursuit of holiness will make us attentive to the things around us, creating rootedness and belonging, which resists feelings of isolation and detachment. So lament brings us into community. It acknowledges the truth of the way the world is and the truth of the way that we experience it. It invites us to participate in healing. I think it makes us more holy. But of course, we're also called to action beyond these immediate communities. Experiences of climate and ecological grief bring home our connection to other parts of the world, to other creatures, and to the whole biosphere. Expressing lament as the body of Christ means we must be attentive to the whole body, not only our part of it. And so penitent action, this call to holiness, will also look like demanding accountability from institutions, from governments, from corporations. And here I do want to specifically name our own church institutions. Are they practicing hope? Are they pursuing holiness? Rooted in our own resilient communities, we will find ourselves strengthened and encouraged by participating in collective action with and on behalf of others too. Now, you've heard a lot of material and information from me and Grace in that first half an hour of our time together. We're going to have a time of reflection now in breakout rooms. So there are 3 questions here that you may want to reflect on together in small groups, just for about 10 minutes before we have a 5-minute screen break. You may not want to talk about these questions, that's fine. You may have other things you want to talk about, but these might be a helpful starting point. So what is your experience or not of climate and ecological grief and anxiety? Have you found space to talk about it? If so, where have you found that space? And if you haven't, why is it difficult to talk about it in the church? What are some of the reasons we really struggle to talk about this? So by the magical power of Zoom and Ruth's fantastic help, you will hopefully be put into breakout groups of about 3 now. And we'll see you in about 10 minutes when we'll have a break from screens before our second half. Thank you, Ruth. Well, welcome back, everyone. It's great to see you back again. In the second half of our time together, we are hoping to explore some of the ways these ideas might be put into practice in our communities. Now, as I emphasised earlier, I believe that lament is fundamentally a communal activity, and that this gathering is made up of many stories and prayers to which we can be attentive beyond our own stories and prayers. And making space for gathering those stories and prayers can also be a fundamentally pastoral activity. But of course, that begins with ourselves. So we're going to begin by taking some time to respond creatively where we are, and then sharing some of these together. And then Grace is going to take us through some examples of lamenting in community. To prompt our time of reflection, I'm going to read a prayer of lament I wrote, and then actually, if we begin, would anyone be willing to just read, has anyone got a Bible handy or is willing to find a passage? If anyone be willing to read just a few lines from Jeremiah chapter 4, just unmute yourself and shout out if you're happy to.
I can do it. I've got a Bible handy.
Lovely. Can you read to us from Jeremiah chapter 4, verses 23 to 28?
Jeremiah 4, 23 to 28. I looked at the earth, and it was chaos, at the heavens, and their light was gone, at the mountains, and they were reeling, and all the hills rocked to and fro. I looked. No one was there, and all the birds of heaven had taken wing. I looked. The fertile land was wilderness, its towns all razed to the ground before the Lord, before his fierce anger. These are the words of the Lord. The whole land will be desolate, and I shall make an end of it. The earth will be in mourning for this, and the heavens above turn black. For I have made known my purpose, and I shall not relent or change it.
Thank you. And I'm now going to read a prayer of lament that I wrote to kind of, again, perhaps prompt your thinking about this as you go into some time of your own creative response. A prayer for those who wish to lament the earth. Merciful God, if I must speak, let it not be my words. They stick to my tongue, to my hands. I trip over unclean lips, and I cannot face my shame. If I must speak, let it not be my words. They are brittle and hard, fall short of tears, refuse to root in this stony soil. If I must speak, let it be my sister's words, my brother's words. Their blood cries out from holy ground. You called them beloved when I did not. If I must speak, let it be Christ's words, whose weeping revived the dead, who was buried a seed, raised a tree, and whose leaves will heal the nations. And that's taken from this book, Rage and Hope, 75 Prayers for a Better World, which Christian Aid put together for their 75th anniversary, edited by Chinny MacDonald and Wendy Lloyd. So as we come to a time of creative response, you might want to write a reflection, a poem, a prayer, you might want to draw an image, or you might just want to sit still for a while and see what images come into your mind. And as you're doing so, it might help you to do any of the following: address it to God, explicitly or implicitly. Think of a creature, a place, an experience, or a hope whose loss you mourn. Describe what it gave and speak its lost voice. Make accusations, perhaps to others, to yourself, or to God. Don't be afraid of anger. Don't be afraid to end without hope if you want to. Hope may be in the action prompted by lament. And you may want to do all of those things in your response. You may want to do none of them or just focus on one or two. So we're going to take almost about 10 minutes now for you to be still where you are. You may want to put on music. You may want to look at images that you have. So you're welcome to turn your camera off and go on mute. You may just want to step outside for 10 minutes. We're going to come back together. If you could come back actually just by like 11:32 or 3, just a little bit less than 10 minutes, and then we'll have time for a couple of people, if they want to share what they've thought about or what they've written or created in this time. So we'll see you back here then. And I'll leave this slide up so that if you want to return to it, you can. We're going to turn to Grace now, who is going to give us some other examples of ways that we can respond in communities, to give you some ideas of really practical next steps that can be taken. Thank you, Grace.
Thank you so much, Hannah, and thank you everybody who shared in that time and space. It was really lovely actually to hear some of the words and reflections, and thanks for having the time to do that. Really, it's a gift to have the time sometimes. What I'm going to do now is just go through some thoughts and observations that I've had over the past few years in the context that I'm in, and just give you some examples of some of the stuff that we have done. There we go. One of the things that we find about eco-grief and anxiety is that we live in a society that's very individualized and very privatized, and this actually suppresses those emotions that we might have, doesn't give them space to be acknowledged, and actually therefore increases anxiety. So there is a way in which this concept of gathering as the body of Christ, as being koinonia, as being a Christian fellowship and a body of believers, can really help in how we deal with and manage our feelings of eco-anxiety and grief. Communal engagement in grief and anxiety can be an act of love and transformation, and we've heard already a bit about how that the gathering and the support can really help to bring on the healing and transformation and give meaning in places that sometimes feel quite meaningless or hopeless. A book that I read recently, which I haven't put on, but I will forward after for those who want, is called See No Stranger by Valerie Kaur. She's a Sikh activist in a way in America, and she talked a lot about how after 9/11 there were a lot of attacks on Sikhs after 9/11 in America, and what happened was the community really came together and supported each other. And she speaks of how that coming together and that communal gathering and expression of grief really led to hopeful places and transformation. An image that I often have, based on the context that I'm in a really diverse context in Moss Side, and we have a lot of funerals pre-COVID. These funerals happened in the way that I'm going to describe. It's a bit different at the moment. We have a lot of people from West Indian backgrounds, Jamaican backgrounds, Dominican Republic, all places in the Caribbean, and when somebody in a community dies, the whole community gathers together. Now, they may not have even known this person. They may just have heard of this person because they've heard of this person. So you can end up in church and at the graveside with 200 plus people gathering together, carrying each other, holding each other in grief. And that really is an image of both grief, but also of hope in the gathering together. And the image that I have used quite a lot recently is this image of compost. When we break down together, when we share those griefs and those anxieties together, we create a richer compost from which hope can emerge. I also share with Hannah some of the frustrations that I've had over the past. I've been an activist my whole life. I remember being one of those annoying children in primary school, wanting to do assemblies on Friends of the Earth and that kind of thing, and always pestering the teachers to start clubs up. And I've always had this kind of activist side to me, but there is a frustration when all this energy is put into activism and what comes out of it is not what one might have hoped. So a lot of what I've done in the past few years is actually create spaces of witness and prayer and gathering with people. So these are just some examples of some of the things that we've done collectively. The first two pictures are taken from a prayer vigil, Christian Climate Action prayer vigil that we held in the centre of Manchester last August. And people gathered together. It was an interfaith, it was a multi-faith gathering. We had speakers, Jewish speakers, Muslim speakers, and Christian speakers, all gathering together to express their grief and their sadness, and to share in our commonality and our common hope. And it was a really profound space of, it really felt like spirit was there, because here we were together, not having the answers, not pretending that we everything was okay, but understanding and recognizing that we're together in this. The third picture you can see is actually another Christian Climate Action event that happened a few years ago, which was a carol singing event. So we changed some of the words to some of the very well-known Christmas carols into the words that reflected the depth and the horrors of the climate emergency. And so there was a real jarring in the singing of these very well-known, sentimental, jolly Christmas carols. And then when people stopped and listened to the words that we were singing, it really sort of, it jarred with people. And actually it's created quite a lot of conversations, and was also again a space where we could gather some of those thoughts about how we were feeling about what was happening. Another thing that we've done, which is much more of a practical thing that we've done in our context, is we've looked to see how as churches we can be places where the community beyond the church can also gather, where we can offer space for all of us in our community, no matter whether we are church going or not, to be places where we can gather and support and talk and think about what we can do that's meaningful in these spaces. So for the past couple of years, we've held what's called an EcoFest, where basically we've just opened the church space. Well, the first EcoFest was different from the second, and you'll see in the video. But the idea was that the church was a hosting space for people to gather from all backgrounds and all different places, and to share and to talk. I'm going to show you a video that kind of summarises what these EcoFests were about. And you'll see that these are not in themselves places where we did a lot of the some of the grief stuff that we've seen before. There were places of communal gathering and talking and sharing, but through that the kind of conversations that we're having with lots of different people really gave space for those anxieties to be voiced, and also for the support to be sourced. So I'm going to stop this share and start the video.
So I'm Judith, I'm from Whalley Range Climate Action Group. We are doing a bit of an experiment today, which is we're asking people to try and think about what a climate-safe future Whalley Range might be like. One where we're no longer burning fossil fuels.
It's been really interesting. We've been talking about what we would see as a vision for Whalley Range in a climate-safe future.
This is the good fight that needs to be fought now. Eco, sustainability, climate change. It's very much in people's minds that we need to be aware of our impact.
This one is about climate and racism and inclusion.
Yeah, so I'm here really to talk to you about why you might choose veganism.
We are having a conversation now all about cycling.
I originate from South Africa. I've lived in this country now for the last 20 years, and of course in the South, the global South, I've seen firsthand the impact of climate change and with the devastating floods and droughts.
It is a social, racial justice issue.
Thinking about our environment, our clean air, the safety of our streets is something that local residents can do something about.
And what we're trying to do is connect concerned citizens across the city to try and push for more radical and more urgent action.
But yeah, I definitely find that my faith and the way that I connect with God, the way that I express who I am and my spirituality is really impacted when I'm out there on a bike.
But I'd like to think of myself not just as an activist, rather as a disciple. It's part of my discipleship to be active in Christian justice work, Christian prayer for justice, working for peace. That's part and parcel of my Christian life.
I want to apologise first of all. That video, as you probably realise, wasn't made for a sort of session on climate grief, but it hopefully helps you to see some of the things that we were doing. I had seen it this morning and thought the music, particularly in the first half, is a bit jarring, and I put subtitles on the whole video and then showed you the wrong video. So I apologise for that. But all those videos are actually available on YouTube, on our YouTube channel, which I can send you the link to if you want to see more about what we've done. But what I just want to conclude my section on is just to sort of encourage you. Obviously, we're currently talking about this in the middle of a pandemic, and what we are able to do is somewhat restricted by the restrictions that we have in place and the way that we might feel ourselves about gatherings and so forth. But there are creative ways in which we can gather and share and grieve and hope together. One of the things that I've set up in Christian Climate Action Manchester, about 6 months ago, I just sent an email around saying, why don't we just gather, say hello, see how everyone's doing, because we hadn't really been active. And we did that for an hour, and everyone said, well, can we do this again? So for the last 6 months, about every 6 weeks, we've just been gathering on Zoom and just chatting and sharing and just being together. So there are ways in which, even in the situations that we're in now, we can find ways in which we can gather and hold each other in that grief and hopefully give each other hope in that. I just want to leave you with that thought, really, and yeah, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Grace. We've got about 10 minutes now for comments, questions, things you'd like to bring to us. And then at the very end of our sort of time together, I'm just going to just close by reading a very brief extract from this book and close us with a prayer. So in the next 10 minutes, feel free to ask us any questions you like. It should be, I think we've got a small enough group that you can probably just unmute yourselves. But if you'd also like to put a question in the chat, then you're very welcome to do that. So over to you. Leslie.
I appreciate that we're a self-selected group, but I think it is encouraging, and it's one of the things that keeps me going, is that the churches and other faith groups are taking a lead on this in many ways, not exclusively, but you know, they are taking a visible lead. And in a time when many people have thought faith and religion to be redundant, that is a source of encouragement to me, and long may we prosper with this.
Thank you, Leslie. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I would very much affirm the need for the church to be very bold in declaring the message of resurrection and hope that we have to offer, and also the demands placed on each of us by God to pursue holiness in our discipleship, and how that connects to our relation to the rest of the world. Of course, there's much more as a church that we can do in this area. And I'm so encouraged to see people beginning to make first steps. I'm a member of the Young Christian Climate Network, and we're in the middle of a pilgrimage from Truro to Glasgow. So I'm doing some of the coordinating for that in the Northeast, and that gives me real hope for the church, seeing that kind of thing take place. One thing that does concern me is the sort of still the dissonance that young people see between what the church does and what they have received from their knowledge of the world. There's recent Tier Fund research that was conducted with Youthscape, which shows that 9 out of 10 Christian young people are concerned about climate change, and only 1 in 10 think their church is doing enough in response. I can share that that research in the resource list that we send as well at the end. But you're absolutely right that there's some really powerful steps being taken by the church, but there's plenty more that we can do. And it's fantastic to see you all here, because each of you represents a whole community of people. So this isn't really just a gathering of 25. It's a gathering of 25 different communities, and that's where this work will start to take place.
And can I just chip in there, Hannah? And please, it's lovely to hear you say that, Leslie. Please do speak up in your churches, and please do, when you have the opportunity, talk to the archdeacons or the bishops to tell them that this is something that you care about, because I think they need to hear from the parishes that this is actually something that really matters, and it is an area of our mission and ministry that is going to be vital going forward. So please, from my perspective as the Dowson Environment Group, it really helps if everyone speaks up. Thank you.
I'd also like you to stand for General Synod, please.
Yeah, and I'll just add a very quick thing. One of the things that is clear is that what the language of climate grief and of eco-anxiety is something that's is talked about in church, but is also talked about in community. And there are the most profound conversations I have had have been with people that have told me, I'm an atheist, I'm part of Exile, I'm an atheist, I don't, but let's talk that. And there's something about the language that we can bring into this conversation, and to people who might not necessarily be churchgoers. but there's something that we share, and there's something that can really connect us in this. So I would encourage also to look at what's going on in your local communities and see how we can connect through this language with people in our local communities too.
Any questions or other things people would like to share? It may be things from your conversation earlier that you'd like to share with the wider group, or it might be a question for me and Grace.
Hi, I'm Helen from Christchurch, Sorby Bridge. Sorby Bridge might be familiar to people about the Boxing Day floods of 2015. So I was just talking in the breakout group where you were saying about the impact on young people, and obviously it's, so just to put something in context, when the town flooded, some of the houses in the town were completely filled. I mean, because they were the bottom floor of mills, floor to ceiling was full of water. And I was having a conversation with somebody when we were talking about the flood wardens were going out, and now we have flood plans and everybody listens to flood alarms and things. And one of the women I was speaking to said that her little boy, whenever it starts to rain heavily, he gets really anxious about, is his house going to flood again? How's it going to happen? And he obviously was sort of primary school. He's now sort of top age of primary school. And there was a new teacher who came to his school and was started doing things about weather and weather forecasting, and was talking about thunderstorms, and couldn't understand why this little boy burst into tears in the middle of the classroom and had to be sort of excused and calmed down, because every time it rains really hard in our valley, you can feel the tension in some people start to rise because they just think it's going to happen again. So, just a note from us that, it's not just monsoons and typhoons. Today's weather forecast might have some people going for their flood barriers to protect their houses. And that's just in the Pennines here, both sides of the hills.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Helen, for sharing that. It's a really, it's really pertinent for this as something which affects these communities that we're called to be witness to, and that we're called to speak to about the hope that we have. And that leads on really well actually to this question that's been asked by Paul and Catherine. How do we find a narrative of hope and a new discipleship that grows out of our grief? Does the church not need to demonstrate a new way of living? Absolutely. There's a great link resource that Grace has just put in the chat there about Christian hope in climate grief. I absolutely agree. I think one of the main challenges that we have is that a lot of our hope language in the church has lost the Christian tradition of understanding hope as a virtue that we are called to practice, like love. It's not just a nice feeling that helps us to get by each day. Just as we don't just call love a feeling in the church, we call it something that we're called to live out. Hope is a virtue. It's as someone's just put in the chat, it's a discipline. So people often ask me, what makes me feel hopeful? And there isn't very much that makes me feel hopeful, but that doesn't stop me from behaving in hopeful ways. In Hebrews, it talks about hope comes from faith in things unseen. And I think for those of us who spend our time, particularly in climate and ecological activism, or are profoundly aware of these changes, what we see does provoke grief and despair, and it does not provoke hope. But that's where I believe that in many ways the Christian message remains unchanged, that God is constantly bringing life out of death, and that's what God's work in the world is, and the work that we are called to. I think on that note, I might just read a section from the end of Words for a Dying World. I love that, exercising the hope muscle. And then we'll close our time together. It's been really wonderful to be joined by all of you today. Thank you so much. We'll be in touch with a resource list after this, and also we'll try and include as best we can the things that have been mentioned in the chat, so that you've got those as well. So this is taken from the conclusion of this, which I've called World Without End. Our grief over a dying world is more than compassion or repentance. It is also a work that transforms us and the world around us. As love, our grief is shaped but not constrained by the places and time we are given. It is able to stretch beyond our own worlds, our own self-help mantras, our own comforts, even into the ages of ages. Prophecies, tongues, and knowledge will all come to an end, but love never ends. It is not that our expressions of love are full or healed. Now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. But nevertheless, our grief, like the world it loves, is not wasted. Reading stories of grief and courage, of love, has been a dark glass through which I anticipate the one and the world that I long to see face to face. It is humbling to begin with those things that are lost and broken as my blurred window for truth about the world. But if the body of Christ is a place where I can learn to look through the glass, then this is what I am trying to do, knowing I do not look alone. The world is not indifferent to pain, and nor is the one who made it, and who will make it whole. So we gather our shared longings to describe this grief, reveal the love that burns at its heart, and offer the courage to pursue it. I do not intend to sanctify trauma or treat suffering as necessary for love, but we are currently unable to love the world without being willing to expose ourselves to the pain of its death. I have coexisted for a long time with the kind of crushing sadness which compels me to worship at the altar of my own despair, feeding hungrily on tears for their own sake, offering up sorrow which does not love life as much as it loves its own abyss. I know the consequences of grieving badly, and I know that I am still trying to learn to grieve well. Becoming open to the grief of others, rather than imagining I grieve alone, turns me out of myself. It is teaching me to practice the kind of grief which sings that the world is both dying and being made, and made over again by love. The world that love makes is a world without end. Look through the glass darkly and be assured that our grief will not be wasted. I'll just close our time together with a benediction from Maggie Dawn, which closes this book. So you may want to close your eyes if that helps you to pray. Sorrows may surround you, sadness overwhelm you, yet be confident of this, that you shall see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. And now may this God, who holds you in trouble, tends you in sorrow, and leads you to green pastures, this 3 in 1 and 1 in 3 God, bless you, and bless you, and bless you.